Hi, my name is Leslie Hendrickson. I'm with the Newburyport Literary Festival. Welcome to our mini festival, Heroes and High Flyers, honoring the brave men and women who have served our country for the last 250 years. Just a few things before we get started. We are using the webinar format in Zoom, which means the audience members can see our participants, but they cannot see themselves and we can't hear you or see you. So if you have comments, please use the chat box down at the bottom of your Zoom box. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation, and if you have questions, you should use the Q&A box, which is also down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We want to support our local bookstores, and we hope that you will check out the links to those bookstores, the Bookshop of Beverly Farms and Jabberwocky, which will be in the chat box. You can find all the books from the festival and more through those links. We hope you'll support them or your local independent bookstore. We want to thank you again for joining us, and without further ado, I'm going to introduce author April Smith, who wrote A Star for Mrs. Blake. April, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And yeah, please, we're looking forward to your presentation.
Okay. Hey, hello everybody. Good morning. I'm speaking to you from Los Angeles. It's a sunny, beautiful Sunday morning here. And we have just awakened from a night, of course, of discourse, violence, and division. So in response to that, I would like to offer you a story of resilience, acceptance, and bonding. This is a story about an incident that happened in American history that was forgotten, mainly because it involved women and the role of women in war, which is quite different now than it was then in the 1930s. But I want to take you now to a time and place where women were honored for their particular sacrifice they made in war. And the nation recognized this in an unprecedented and never to be repeated act of generosity called the Gold Star Mothers Pilgrimages of 1930s. Now, if you ask, if nobody knows about this, why do I know about it? And I have a very personal connection to it. A dear friend of mine named Nicholas Hammond, who is a wonderful actor, director, and producer, who you may know as having played Friedrich as a child in The Sound of Music. Well, Nicholas comes from a military family, and his own father, Thomas Hammond, was a graduate of West Point in the 20s, and he was chosen to lead the Gold Star Mothers Pilgrimages because, in the wisdom of the War Department, it was decided that a 24-year-old boy would be the perfect one to lead a group of bereaved mothers to visit the graves of their sons in France. Now, this was a program that was sponsored by the United States government. It cost about $5 million. And it took about 6,000 to 7,000 women from all over the country on first-class transportation to France to see the graves of their sons and husbands who had been killed in World War I and buried overseas. So Nicholas Hammond's dad was one of these officers. It was an assignment of great honor to accompany the Gold Star Mothers. And the good news is that Thomas Hammond kept a diary. Nicholas showed me this diary years ago. It was handwritten in a Wanamaker's department store calendar book. So within the ads for furs and jewelry, Thomas wrote down his impressions of shepherding this group of 12 women through the most life-changing journey imaginable from his point of view. And from the beginning, I knew this was a story that had to be told. In my book, the main character is Cora Blake. She comes from New England, and parenthetically, I have to say that I have great love and affection for New England. I went to BU undergraduate, lived in Cambridge, spent many summers in Maine, and recently had the privilege of coming to Gloucester to be part of the T.S. Eliot program of residency for writers there. So Cora Blake, for me, comes out of the earth. She comes out of this fishing village that we used to take our own family to every summer. And I went there and spoke with all of the residents who knew about the Gold Star Mothers program. I even met a 100-year-old librarian who was there when armistice happened. So it was all of the events in the book are true and rooted in truth. Now, just to give you a little background on the war, the size of the war, World War I, from all countries combined, there were about 65 million troops involved in this. Of those, about 8,500 million were killed. Total casualties were about 37 million. Okay, so in the United States, we entered the war late, and we mobilized about 4,300,000 troops, and of those, 116,519 were killed. Now, of those, the families had a choice of where to bury their sons. It was a very divisive issue because some people felt that it was more patriotic to bury your son or husband where he died in the fields of our foreign allies. That was an act of patriotism. Of course, other families wanted the remains to come home. So where to bury your loved one was a family choice. In the end, there were 30,000 fatalities of our boys. And in the American cemeteries of France, there's about, well, there are 14,000 in Musée where this story takes place. But it wasn't until 13 years after the war that the Gold Star Mothers pilgrimages took place. And it didn't happen out of the goodness of the government's heart. It happened because women, wealthy women mainly, rallied, got together, went to Washington in the late 20s, and stood up for the women who had lost their loved ones in an economic sense. Because at that time, there wasn't a pension or any kind of care given to bereaved women who were suddenly left alone with no means of support. So these women went to Washington and lobbied, and that was the beginning of things like Mother's Day and the Gold Star Mothers pilgrimages. Now, the other thing to remember is that the 1930s was a time of deep prejudice and racial segregation. And the women were segregated on the tour. And this is a big part of A Star for Mrs. Blake. It's a beautiful, beautiful story, but I don't want to minimize it or sugarcoat it at all. So in the book, you have two groups of women we follow. One are the white mothers and the other are the Black mothers. Tragically, the Black mothers were treated differently. And while the white mothers went on first class ocean liners, the Black mothers went on tramp steamers. And in the wisdom of the War Department, they believed that this was what the Black mothers, quote, wanted because they'd be more comfortable in, quote, their own environment. But the book bridges those gaps because, of course, all of them share the same losses. And in that way, the book wants to be a journey of understanding and a kind of united cause. I mean, all of these women had gone through the same thing. And looking at the real people who did this, you have to remember it was a real act of courage to leave your small town, to go to a place you've never heard of, where you don't speak the language, where you believe people eat frogs, okay? And Colonel Hammond, he became a colonel. He started out as a lieutenant. He became a colonel, Nicholas's dad, and eventually an attaché to Eisenhower. So he gives us the facts of life in his diary. And one of the facts of life was the hilarious requirement of these young lieutenants to keep records of everything that happened to these Gold Star mothers. Now, if you ever went to summer camp when you were a kid, at least in my crazy summer camp, the counselors were required to keep a record every day of every camper's activities, including bowel movements. Now, believe it or not, that was kind of the attitude of taking care of these women who were accompanied not only by the young lieutenant, but a nurse. So the good news about the research on this book was there's tons and tons of War Department records. And I've made lots of research trips for this book. I've gone to France with my son, which was very powerful. We went to Paris and we followed the journey, the actual itinerary of the Gold Star mothers, because I had that from the War Department documents. We went out to the cemeteries, we breathed the air. And going back to the documents, I also went to the National Archives in some bizarre hidden satellite building in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., where you ferret in there. And there were these carbon copies. The other thing is they made all these were hand typed, and they were in duplicate, triplicate on this, onion skin paper. But there you saw the degree to which these women were watched as if they were children, if they had a headache, if they had a fight with their roommate on the boat. It was all documented. So it was really a gold mine in terms of reproducing this for the reader. Now, World War I also was distinguished by the fact that it was a war of technology. And when you think about it, every war is a war of new technology. Then, of course, we know it was trench warfare. But I discovered that trench warfare created a new kind of injury as well, which is also integrated into the book. The doctors were seeing injuries they'd never seen before. The Germans had come up with a diabolical combination of a 1-2 punch. They would lob tear gas into the Allied trenches. And when the soldiers stood up gasping for air, they would mow them down with machine guns. Now, automatic high-powered machine guns were new, and they were obviously very deadly. And what they did, though, is they created a whole new kind of injury, a facial injury, which no one had ever seen before, and no one knew what to do. But there were doctors in England who were specialists in facial surgery, and they basically invented facial surgery. And the injured, picture this, the injured men were taken from the field of battle to the coast, ferried across to England, I'm talking about France, and went through maybe 16 operations. Many of them did not survive, but many of them did in reinvented forms. And one of the things they came up with were these very thin masks that were made of an amalgam of metal. They were fitted to the face. They used old photograph. They used plaster masks. And there's a very important character in the book named Griffith Reed, who becomes a love interest of Cora Blake. He's an American who suffered this injury, and he's an expat journalist in Paris. So the book is not only about the journey of these women, but it's also a love story between these two isolated and needy figures. So Cora Blake is a librarian from this small town in Maine. And the group that she joins is completely diverse, as they really were. We have Minnie, who's about, oh, by the way, I should say that these groups were organized by where their sons fought. So they would be from a unified geographic area, in this case, a certain regiment in New England that I made up. So the others in her group are Minnie, who's the timid wife of a Jewish chicken farmer. We have the opposite, Bobby Olson, a Boston Brahmin who's fantastically rich. We have Selma, who's an African-American seamstress who came up from the South to work in the factories of Boston. She's a grandmother. We have Katie, who's an Irish maid. And we have Wilhelmina, who's a former tennis star in a very precarious state, whose husband put her in an insane asylum because that's what you did with women you didn't understand. And there was a line in Downton Abbey that spoke to me when Mrs. Crowley reflects on the death of her son Matthew, who died tragically. And she says, quote, "Once your only child has been killed, you stop being a mother, you stop being anything." Well, I think the ladies who inspired this book would beg to differ. You never stop being a parent. You never stop feeling the loss. And I'd like to make a cut to the Gold Star mothers of today, with whom I had the honor and privilege of getting to know. There is a very active and powerful organization, the Gold Star Mothers of America, but we have since expanded this notion of loss not only to females, but to men and families. So I learned about the community of Gold Star families. And as I got to know these women personally, I was invited to attend a convention that's held every year in Washington, D.C., put on by TAPS, T-A-P-S, which is Tragedy Assistant Program for Survivors. And this is specifically for Gold Star families. Just to give you a current sense of the emotional toll and the kind of life that you live having gone through this loss. There were about 2,500 people at this meeting taking place in a hotel in Washington, and a whole program for children. And I was invited because they did a book club where they asked couples to read my book. And we had a separate meeting in a big circle, moderated by a very skilled, psychologist, in which these couples were able to talk about their experiences through the lives of the characters. It gives me the chills just to think about it. It was enormously powerful. Men read this book from a woman's point of view, and yet they were able to find a universality in what the characters had gone through. All of which is to say that what you read is authentic as I can make it. So people ask about the Gold Star. Where did that come from? Well, it goes back to a tradition in World War I, in which the bereaved parents, I believe both men and women, no, it was just women, where women who had lost a child in the war wore a black armband with a gold star on it. Now, going back another decade, I mean, not decade, but about 5 years, when the war was going on, there was a tradition of what they called honor flags. And these flags were handmade, and you can find them in some museums, and they're very, very touching. They were handmade by the families at home. Just a blue star on a random background that they hung in the windows because they were proud of the fact that their son was serving the United States. And then when or if that boy was killed, you sewed a gold star over the blue star. That became the gold star, and it identified the families of having had this loss, but also as being patriots. So then when the boy was killed, the mother would wear a black armband with a gold star on it. Apparently, they say President Wilson was the one who came up with the phrase Gold Star Mothers. Now, the Gold Star was still around in World War II, but it disappeared. Why? Because of Vietnam. Because during the Vietnam War, it would have been dangerous in some areas to express the fact that your child had fought in the war. And so women didn't do that anymore. And so this whole kind of experience kind of went underground for a while until recently, when the Gold Star mothers and families reemerged and are now taking their place, their rightful place in military history. So I've had a great run with this book, and I hope you'll pick it up, and I hope you'll think differently about military families and how they always need our support. We've witnessed the denigration of Gold Star families in the last few years, and that should never happen again. As part of my research, by the way, I went back to this little town in Maine, and I went back to the cemeteries there, and I saw gold stars there for some of the men who had died. And it was a real difficult decision to make. And in the book, Cora Blake agonizes about that she doesn't have her son nearby so that she can visit him. But that's why she makes this trip. And in the end, she does find a kind of resolution and a new kind of love. And I think all the characters in the book are changed by this journey, and I hope you will be too. So do we have any questions that we need to address?
Well, thank you so much, April. That was wonderful. I had a quick question about sort of the evolution of, you said the Gold Star went out of commission, sort of, people weren't using it, but there's obviously been a way for patriots and supporters of the troops to show their support through gold bands, through yellow ribbons. Mm-hmm. Was there any of that evolution of those symbols part of your research? Did that come up at all?
I didn't, because I stopped, historically where the book stopped.
Mm-hmm. Right, gotcha.
But clearly there's always an impulse. We are all connected, and we all feel, the loss, and we all feel the pride. So yes, people are always finding ways to express it. And I'm so grateful now that it's become a cultural, almost imperative to support the troops, especially now that we're going through it, with the pandemic and so forth. The spotlight is being shown on those who support our society.
Right. Well, in our chat, we have a lot of compliments about the book, including one from Julie Cook about how she loved the book, as did her book club.
Right.
And another about from Evan Levinson, who also enjoyed the book tremendously. have you had a lot of engagement with book clubs through this book, and how's that process been for you?
It's great. Book clubs are great. Hello, book clubs. And I've gone to local book clubs in Los Angeles, and I speak at them as well. You know, when we were promoting this book, it just got a huge response. It was chosen as an all-city reads book in 3 cities. Cincinnati did literally a 3-day festival around it. We did book clubs, and I can tell you, you know, people cry in bookstores when they hear the story, and it's so touching. People come up to me and they say, you know, I want to go there. I want to go there and find my great uncle's grave. So the emotional response has been enormous. There's no question that the story hits a mark.
Right. We have one question from Stephen, who also loves your books,
Thank you.
about, you know, obviously this is a very sad topic, and how did you personally deal with that as you were researching and writing the piece?
That's a very good question. I cried. I really cried. And, you know, especially in the company of the Gold Star moms. The first time I encountered them in real life was at a book signing in Palo Alto, where they just showed up. I should backtrack and say the first Gold Star mother I met, Karen Meredith, who is an activist for the group, we met on a radio show in San Francisco. And she was my entree into that world. And that was great. But then months later, I did this event in Palo Alto, and I'm getting the chills, 6 Gold Star mothers showed up at the bookstore.
Wow.
And, you know, it breaks your heart over and over again. You know, I haven't, nothing has diminished in terms of the emotionality for this book. And also, I think, having had the experience of walking in the footsteps of these women with my own son, who was in his 20s, early 20s at the time, just made it real, you know. And we walked out on the field. If anybody wants to get information about following their footsteps, I can, you know, write to me at aprilsmith.net. And I said the itineraries exist, but you can also go on tours of the battlefields. And there are collections of relics from those battlefields that you can see and touch and feel. Like there are perfume bottles that the Germans used for schnapps. You know, you can pick up bullets and casings and all kinds of stuff. And carvings. When they were stuck in the trenches, they would carve on, you know, anything they could, copper and wood. So those relics made it real too, in terms of the soldiers. And there's a scene in the book where Cora kind of gets lost, and she wanders through this kind of emaciated woods, and she comes across these old trenches of the Germans. And that was an experience that we really had on this sort of walk. You see the forest still decimated, and it happens in the book, but it scared the hell out of me, because in the trenches there was the remnants of this German village. They were there for like 4 years, ferrying supplies on. They built railroads, and there was the remains of this kind of structure that was half in the ground. And it was just like swarming with bees. I mean, we went down there and it was like bees, like, ah. So it was alive, as it were. And that all of those visceral experiences that you have in the research, hopefully are reflected in the page.
Right. You were just talking about meeting some of the Gold Star mothers. So someone was wondering what was their reaction to this book, and have they been in touch with you to talk about it with you?
They were very grateful. They were very touched. They reached out to me and invited me to private memorial services that are held every year in San Francisco, where it just, it hits you over and over and over again when you realize the lifetime that these people live with this reality. And in these memorial services, which is just them, you see women, parents come and they set up kind of iconic displays that honor their sons. I mean, things like high school pictures and buttons and memorabilia. And it breaks your heart over and over.
Yeah. Another question is about, do you keep the characters that you created in your book in your mind, and do you keep in touch with them?
Yes, I do. And in a perfect world, they would live again on some streaming service. I mean, there is, of course, I also write for television, and Nicholas and I have made many efforts to get this made. All the way back when I was developing this, and I was working at ABC Films, they would not make this movie because, quote, it's about women, and it's, quote, period. So that's been an obstacle, believe it or not. But hopefully now, in the age of streaming and all this, diversity that we have in product, I've never given up the fight to get this made. And so in answer to that question, yes, they live with me every day. And I think they each deserve their own storylines, which would be just so exciting to do. So everybody, think good thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, April, we really appreciate you being here with us today and presenting your book with us. And we hope that you have a great day in California. Thank you all for being here with us today. We have one more event at 1 o'clock if you care to join us. Otherwise, enjoy your day. I hope it's beautiful where you are, and take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.